Good morning, good morning. We begin today's daf Vav in Maseches Shevuos. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank the Tilson family for sponsoring all the shiurim of the years. It's close for Mr. Tavos for Am Yisrael. We also thank Shmuel and Rabbi Karabkin for sponsoring all the shiurim of the month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shmuel's father, Leonard Karabkin, Lipa ben Yecheskel Kain on Pesach Sheni, the Shamash Havan Aliyah, and the Shamash Havan Acham. We also thank Aryeh Lichterman for sponsoring the shiurim of the week. Le'ilu Nishmas Haley's mother, Linda Kotin, Rachel Leah Bas Ruven Meir, and the Shamash Havan Aliyah, and the Shamash Havan Achama. So today's daf is daf Vav. Yesterday we started this Gemara, went through it a little bit quickly, and just to quickly review what we're discussing, because it's going to be the subject of today's entire daf. And thank you to Maishi for showing me the visual that the art scroll has. And it might be helpful just to look at it, just because it's not like a major picture, but just seeing the order of how it's drawn out in the chart might be helpful. So you have Baharas on the top, Se'es comes next, then you have lime, and then you have egg membrane. So the Gemara described yesterday that you have, we'll just to quickly see it inside again. We're going to go back to basically halfway down the Yomi Daf Hey Amud Beis. I'm not going to learn the whole Gemara again, but just to describe what it says. The Gemara says, Tan Hasam, Maras Nagayim Shnaim Shem Arba. Our Mishnah mentions that when it comes to the Maras, the view of the various different types of Nagayim, the different leprosies or the spots that someone could get, it's 2, which is 4. So you have Baharas, which is all the way at the top. What is that? That's Azah Kashalag. It's a really bright white, which is like snow. So again, in this picture that there is in the art school, you have that at the top. And then you have the next one, Shni Allah, the secondary one to that one is Kesida Hechel. It's like the lime of the sanctuary. Now, what that means is that its secondary one is lime, but it's not the second brightest color. It's the secondary to the Bahara. So you have snow all the way at the top, and then you skip a step and you go to lime, and then you have, after that, you have Se'es, Ketzemer Lavan. Se'es, which is the other one which is mentioned in the Torah, is like white wool. And then Shni Allah, the secondary one to that one, is Kekrum Beitza. It's like the membrane of the egg. So again, the way that the chart looks, I think Moshe sent it out to the group, is that you have Baharas at the top, which is the most bright. You have egg membrane at the bottom, which is the weakest white. And then you have in the middle, you have Se'es, which is number 2, which is the wool. And then you have lime, which is number 3. So now, interestingly, the Av, the main category of each one, is going to be separated from its Tolda, its second one, by the other Av. So again, just to speak this out, you have at the top the Av of Baharas, and then under that you have the Av of Se'es, and then you're going to have the Tolda of lime, which comes next, and then you're going to have the Tolda of egg membrane, which comes next. So now what the problem we described yesterday is that according to Rabbi Akiva, we know, is it working? Yeah. What Rabbi Akiva taught us is, it goes Zula Malamizu. In order to combine them, because the halacha is, for a Negat Saras to be considered Tameh, it needs to be the size of a gris. What's that practically? The way we deal with this when it comes to Nida, it's gris v'ayid is about the size of a penny. So let's just say a penny size. The spot needs to be the size of a penny. What if it's not? What if you have one spot which is 2 different shades, and the 2 different shades are from 2 different, will make up the whole spot. So you have one spot, let's just say it's perfectly symmetrical and it's perfectly round. Now half of it is going to be one shade of white, the other one's going to be the other shade of white. Says Rabbi Akiva, you could only combine them if they're the 2 shades of white which follow each other in this color scheme. So now the problem is, according to Rabbi Akiva, you could only combine snow with wool, and then lime with wool, and then egg membrane with lime. That's the only way you can do it. However, the problem with that is that would cross over into different types of negaya. You have two problems. Number one, it has to go in order of the color scheme. Number two, you can't combine one av with another av, or one tolda with a different av. You can't combine a secondary color with the primary color from a different one. So therefore, you're going to have a problem combining the wool color with snow color, because those are two different categories. You have category A, which is snow, category B, which is wool, so they can't be combined. And now lime and egg membrane, although they follow each other in the color scheme, they can't either be combined, because lime is the secondary, it's the tolda of wool, of snow, sorry. Lime is the secondary one of snow. In other words, what we'll call it is Sid. Sid Heichel is the secondary category of Bahares, which is the Sheleg. So those two can only be combined, but they can't because there's a color in between. See how that works out? That was the Gemara's point yesterday, is that in order to combine these two colors, you're going to have to either skip a color or cross over from one color scheme to another color scheme, from one category of colors to another category of colors. And therefore, the Gemara wanted to suggest that when our Mishnah says you have these shtaim shehein arba, you have these two categories, it's not going to fit with Rabbi Akiva. What is Rabbi Akiva's opinion going to have to be? Rabbi Akiva's opinion is going to have to be that the two secondary colors are both a tolda of se'es. In other words, you have Baharis, which is at the top. Baharis is the brightest white. What is that? That's snow, like a fresh, brand new, bright white snow. That's Baharis at the top. And then you have another av, another main category, which is called se'es, which is the tzemer lavan, that white wool. Now, underneath se'es, you'll have two secondary categories. What is that? You're going to have sida heichel, which is the lime, and you're going to have the egg membrane, which we said is krum beitza. So all of that, those two are going to follow as the two secondary categories of se'es. So how, according to Akiva, can you combine two colors? It's very simple. Baharas will have to be by itself because it is its own av, its own category. So therefore, if a person has a spot that has Baharas color on it, which is snow white, it's going to have to be a color, one solid color inside that spot of snow white. Now, if the person does not have the brightest white, and he comes before the Kohen, and he shows it to the Kohen, the Kohen says, yeah, it looks like half of your nega over here has got like a wool color, like a fresh white wool color, but the other half varies a little bit. Let me see what it is. If the other half is going to be the sida heichel, the lime color, we'll say no problem. You can go ahead and combine them because it follows each other in the color scheme. If the other half is going to be the egg membrane color, the Kohen will say, that's fine. It can't be combined. Your nega is not the right color, and you're off the hook. It's tahar. Alternatively, if he has a half lime spot and a half egg membrane spot, according to Akiva, that's going to be a problem. He's going to be tameh. However, according to our Mishnah, it won't, because those are in two different categories, and those cannot be combined. That's where we pretty much left off yesterday. So now the Gemara starts going to the 2, 4, 6 lines in Daf Vav Amud Aleph. Now the Gemara wants to know, okay, now that we've established, it seems like our Mishnah cannot be Rabbi Akiva. Why can't it be Rabbi Akiva? Because our Mishnah does make these two categories and connects it in the way that the picture shows it over here in the art scroll. So now that that's the case, so now what? How do we know that Rabbi Akiva says this? Where indeed do we find that Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that we say zulam alamizu? In other words, what we're trying to figure out over here is that Rabbi Akiva says Baharas, snow white is its own category, se'es is its own category, which carries both subcategories underneath it. Ilema, perhaps you suggest Mihadatanya, it comes from the following place where we learned in the Brisa, Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said, what did he tell us? He told us a story that Shaul Yoshua beno Rabbi Akiva, mi Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yeshua, the son of Rabbi Akiva, asked his father the following question. Rashi points out He is often known as Yeshua ben Karcha, and Rabbi Akiva was called Karcha. One reason is because he was bald. Others say that doesn't make sense, that he would get a nickname of being Karcha just because he was bald. But ultimately, it is Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Yeshua ben Karcha, or Yeshua ben Rabbi Akiva, asked his father the following question: amru maros negayim shnayim shehin arba. Why is it that in our Mishnah, when we talked about negayim, we said the visuals of maros, the visuals of negayim are two categories which divide into four. In other words, Tosas explains, if you see this tiny little Tosas over here, called Mipnei Ma Amru, he says, Pirush, Lama Hiskiru Klal Shmosei. Gemara is not exactly clear about what it means by this question, but Tosas explains that he asked his father, why do we need to actually mention the names of these things all together? In other words, we're only a few minutes into this shir this morning, and everyone's already confused because they keep mentioning all these different colors. Snow white, is it wool white? Is it lime white? Is it egg white? And everyone's thinking, for heaven's sake, I don't even know the difference between these colors. So what are you telling me all these colors for? Now, if you look at Rashi points out, you'll see he makes this point later, that essentially his question was, there's a Mishnah in Pesachim which says, La'olam yilma yishana adam l'talmido derech ktsara. When a person is teaching his talmidim, you always want to try to teach things in the easiest, most concise fashion. You'd rather leave out all the extra details and just give the necessary details. So he was asking his father, why are we giving all these colors? And he explains. So now he answered him in this is probably the makar for answering a question with a question. Good Jewish concept. Amrullah, he said to him, Imlav ma yamru. So what should we do? What's your problem? Your problem is that we mentioned all these colors. What are you suggesting? What would you like to do? These are the colors that you need to know in order to determine whether someone is pure or impure. So what do you mean? What do you ask? Why does it mention the colors? We need to know the colors. So he explained to him, Yomi, he said to him, Mikrum beitza ulamai latame. In other words, the point that you're making is that these are the four brightest white colors. So why don't you just mention the least bright of the bunch, which is the membrane of the egg, and say, membrane of the egg is the threshold. If you have a dimmer white than the dried out membrane of an egg, so then you're automatically going to be tahar. You'll be pure because that's not considered a problem. If it's brighter than that, you've got a problem. In other words, that's very simple. Mention one thing. Like this, all Kohanim have to have in their house is one dried out membrane from an egg to use as comparison. They'll keep it in their pocket, and anytime someone comes by with a question, what are they going to do? They'll pull out this little membrane, say, is it brighter? Is it less bright? If it's brighter, the guy is tamei. If it's less bright, he says to him, you're off the hook, and it's not a problem. Who needs to mention all the rest of the colors? So Amrlo, so Rabbi Akiva said back to his son, well, Lomar, we needed to mention all these different colors to teach us shemetzdarfim zeh im zeh, to tell us the colors that can be combined one with the other. In other words, if I just told you the threshold of what's considered white enough, then I would not know the categories of which ones can be combined with the other ones. So Amrlo, so he said to him, okay, fine, I get that, Dad. However, V'yomru, why doesn't it just say mikrum beitza u'l'mayla tamei, that you'll start with the membrane of the egg and say anything more bright than that is going to be impure? Umitzdarfim zeh im zeh. So add that line in. Big deal. Again, let's try to teach our students in the easiest possible way. Say what is considered to be a color of tzaras that's a problem. If it's as bright as the membrane of an egg or brighter, it's going to be tamei. And guess what? You could combine all those bright colors together with each other. Amrlo, he said to him, Lomar lacha, you know why it tells us all the colors? The reason why it tells us all the colors is to teach us kol kohen she'eno baki bahen ubishmosayim eino roa es hanagayim. We needed to teach something else, which is that you shouldn't be getting involved in this process of checking colors if you don't know the colors. There are certain things you have to know in order to paskin these questions. Now, the truth is that this is subject to somewhat of a debate. I don't want to get into it right now because the halacha really is a kohen doesn't have to be a baki in anything. The halacha actually is that if a kohen doesn't know the halacha, we know that the Tahar Tameh declaration needs to be made by a Kohen, but some Kohanim just didn't know it. So what would they do? They would employ a professional nega checker to work with them, and they would stand there, and the Kohen would basically just sit there in the seat, and the nega checker would examine it. So you'd have this, let's just say, dermatologist who worked for the Kohen, and he looked at it, and he would say, yeah, Mr. Kohen, this one is a problem, and he's Tameh. So the Kohen would say, Tameh, and then move on. But ultimately, the bottom line is, what it means to say is, if the Kohen is going to rely on his own checking, he has to make sure to know the various different colors to go ahead and check it. Now, here's the main point that the Gemara makes. When his son, Rabbi Yeshua, was suggesting what he could have said, he only said from egg membrane and up is going to be a problem. Now, if he knew his father's opinion was similar to our Mishnah, which is, there are two different categories. There's category 1, which is egg membrane and up, and category 2, just say the other way around. There's category 2, which is egg membrane and up, and category 1 is lime and up. He should have said to his father that, we're just right in the Mishnah, there's two different categories, egg membrane and lime and up. Just say that and everything will be clear. Now, v'ilu mi sid ha'echel l'mala lo kama. He didn't say that. So it must be Midelo Amarle, since he didn't suggest to his father that we should just write it simply in the Mishnah, that there are two categories. One of them is from egg membrane and up is Tameh, from lime and up is Tameh, and you could combine each category with each other. Obviously, he didn't say that because that wasn't Rabbi Akiva's opinion. In other words, the point that we're trying to make over here is that according to Rabbi Akiva, you're going to have Baheres, which is snow at the top, and then you have Se'es, which is going to be the wool, and then beneath Se'es you have lime and egg membrane. Now, since he only said egg membrane and up, it must be he was of the opinion that his father grouped all that together. Because if he didn't group that together, it would be inaccurate to say you could combine everything together. Now, the fact that he suggested, you see egg membrane, which includes lime, which includes wool, and he said he could combine all those together, it must have been that was Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Rabbi Akiva's opinion was you could combine egg membrane, lime, and wool together. Now, if that wasn't true, he would have said egg membrane and up can be combined, lime and up can be combined because they're two different categories. The fact that he didn't say that must be that Rabbi Akiva didn't hold that. So, it must be that all of them can be combined with se'es because they're all subcategories of se'es. The Gemara says, no, that's not a raya. Dilma, perhaps, se'es v'todosea, beheresh v'todosea. In other words, we're quoting a conversation over here between a father and son. Now, maybe the father and son conversation that we have is not 100% 100% reported with all the information that they said. He just was asking his father, why not make it simple? Maybe indeed, when he did discuss with his father, he mentioned, yeah, you'll have each category and so on. So you don't have a raya. In other words, could be, you don't have a clear raya from here. The Rabbi Akiva held that se'es was the top category for lime and egg membrane. It may not be the case. It's possible yes, it's possible not, but it's not a proof from here. Gemara says, "Elamid Rabbi Chanina must come. This must be coming from Chanina. Why? Damar Chanina mashal Rabbi Akiva l'mal davar doma." If you're trying to understand Rabbi Akiva's opinion when it comes to the colors of these different spots, how do you understand it? So he explains it as follows: La'arba kosel shel chalav. You have 4 cups of milk. So in other words, they all start off as 4 bright white cups of milk. Echad naflu tocho shnei tipim shel dam. In 1 cup, 2 drops of blood fell into it. So it loses a little bit of the brightness because of the red that goes into it. Into another cup of milk, 4 drops of blood fell in. Sheldam. Into another one, 8 drops fell in. Into the last one, either 12 or 16 drops of blood fell in there. Now what happens? Since it's a full cup of blood, and it's a full cup of milk, and it's only a minimal amount of blood that fell in there, the Gemara says, Shekulan, all these cups, Maros Lobenhe, they're all still going to have a very they're still going to be white. It's still going to have a white color to it. Ella shazella malamizeh. There's going to be like a little bit of like I think the term is like a hue of some other color that goes into it. So it takes away from the brightness of the white. In other words, we're not suggesting that all of a sudden this cup of milk is going to turn pink. What will happen is it will lose a little bit of its brightness, and that's how we understand Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Now again, what's going on over here? What we're saying is that it's all just a scale of colors. The top one is the brightest. The second is not as bright. The third is a little bit less bright, and the fourth is the most dim of the bunch. But again, the point is, each one is just one step higher than the next, which is exactly Rabbi Akiva's opinion, because he says you basically just group them together and they go one on top of the next. Gemara says, no, hold on a second. You perhaps mixing up two things over here, says the Gemara. Maybe Rabbi Akiva would say this. In other words, this mashal, this parable, or this would only be relevant when we're talking about a pasach. What's a pasach? Pasach is, in the parsha of Negayim, there are some Negayim which are adamdam. They have red to it. Now that's what he's talking about. This is not a shade of white. This is the type of nega which has a little bit of a red tinge to it. So when talking about a red tinged one, said, okay, you could understand why it would have a little bit of blood in there, because it's whiteness with a little bit of red tinge to it. So yes, it is starting to turn pink because you're putting something red. So that is where Rabbi Akiva gives this mashal, he gives this parable, or this analogy to understand what it will look like. He gives that when we're talking about a red-tinged mara. However, when we're talking about b'chalak with the white one, who says that he even compares these two things? B'chalak misham elei. How do you know that this parable is relevant to a white one? Now, v'chitema. Now, you might suggest ki heichad elei b'pasach hachisham elei b'chalak. In other words, what's the difference? Rabbi Akiva is of the same opinion whether it's a reddish mara or if it's a whitish mara. It makes no difference. It's all going to be the same. In other words, the idea really is, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that it's just a color scheme. You could combine them all together. The Gemara says, now hold on a second. Now that you've done that, I'll go back and actually analyze even the first one. How do you actually even know that when it comes to this reddish kind of nega, that he actually says that? Tanya. We learned in our brisa. Now, if you look, they switch it to Vatnan because it's really a Mishnah. Vatnan, Rabbi Akiva says, Adam dam, the redness shebazeh v'shebazeh, the redness of this and that. What's the shebazeh? So you look down in Rashi, the fourth to last line on the page. He says, Al karch. When you say shebazeh v'shebazeh, what he's talking about is Al rishon v'sheni ka'amar, the first two. Shekain Lashon Mishnah, that's what Mishnah is talking about. V'hachi ka'amar, this is what he means to say. Let's just read the Rashi, we'll go back to the Gemara. Adam dam sheberishon v'sheni, the redness of the first and the second, the siman is pesichas odem shebehen. You start decreasing the redness in them, and the pesichas odem shebehen yikaris makam acher kagon tipas dam b'chalav umar'ein adam v'lo lavan. So let's go. We'll explain this and come back to it. But Rabbi Akiva says, the redness of the first two is kiyayin hamazog. It's like wine, which was diluted b'mayim with water. Ela shel baheres. But when it talks about baheres, azakashelik, it's strong like snow. B'shal sid diahemenu. When it comes to sid, it's a little bit lighter than that. Now, look what he just said. He said, when he starts going with bazeh, Rashi pointed out bazeh means the first two. And then what did he go ahead and mention? He mentioned baharas at the top, which is azak kashelig, which is snow. We always put that in the highest category. And then the next one, he said, v'shal sid diahimenu. And sid, lime, is underneath it. Now, hold on a second. The way we understood Rabbi Akiva was, if Rabbi Akiva is going in order, he should have said, turn to the page, you'll see this at the top of the Yamud. Now, in Esau, if indeed it's true that Rabbi Akiva actually held that we go in color scheme, shall tsemer diahimenu miboile. According to the way we understood it, the way it would go is it would start with baharis, which is snow, and then he would go on to explain the second one as wool. He didn't do that. he said the one underneath it is lime. So this whole throws our whole thing off. Because according to what we're trying to accomplish is, Rabbi Akiva says, snow's at the top, then comes wool, then comes lime, then comes the egg membrane. Now the whole thing just now got thrown off because Rabbi Akiva himself, when it comes to this pasuk, actually starts off by saying snow, and then he skips a step and goes to sid, to lime, which is exactly the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish for his opinion. Gemara says, Amri, the second line in Vav Beis, Einach Nami. That's really what he meant. But Tanya, as it said, Rav Nasan Omer, Lo Sha'am Rabbi Akiva shall sid dia himenu. It's not that Rabbi Akiva meant to say that sid is the next one, which is more dim. Ella shall tsemer dia himenu. He meant to say wool. Okay, in other words, so here's where we're going to have a raya from. In other words, you're getting thrown off from the fact that when it came to this pasuk that he skipped a step. No, that's not what he meant. He meant to actually say lime, so he meant to say wool. So yes, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that you have beharis at the top, then you have se'es, and then you have the two subcategories which follow that, which are the lime and the egg membrane, and then we're going to say, just like you said when it comes to a pasuk, which is a mara that has a little bit of redness in it, same thing will be true when you'll have a mara which has no redness, just that the white starts to get a little bit more dim as we go along the color scheme. All right, now the Gemara goes on. How do we know that Baharis, and the pasuk says Baharis, it's the brightest color? The Gemara answers, Minol and the Baharis Azahi, Amar Abaya, Amar Kra, in Baharis Levana he. So he Levana ben Acharis Levana. The pasuk says if he's going to have this Baharis which is white, and the Gemara says Levana he, which means she is the whitest. She is white. When the Gemara goes ahead and when the pasuk explains that something is like the quintessential white, so what this Baharis is going to be the whitest of whites. Okay, Tana Rabbanan. Baharis is amuka. Baharis is a very deep type of color. Omer, and it says similarly in the pasuk, amok mina'ar. Its view is deeper than the skin. I think it's pronounced umar eha. It's umar eha amok mina'ar. Its mara is deeper than the skin. So you see, Baharis is going to be deep. What does that mean that it's deep? The Gemara explains. Kemara chama ha'amuka minatzel. Sometimes if you have the sun, which is surrounded by a lot of shade, what happens is it will look like the sun, even though it's uniform. It's exactly in the same place. Again, I don't necessarily mean the sun and whatever shade is there is in the same place, but if you have some type of light which is exactly the same place as the shade, the light will look like it's deeper in just because the shade is darker around it, so the light looks much deeper. That's what Gemara means. It's so bright when you have something which is so bright next to something which is dark. What's brighter will look like it's recessed behind. That's why we call it deep. So when it comes to se'es, what does that mean? So let's just remember the pasuk says that a person se'es o sapachas o bahares. So now when you're learning that pasuk for the very first time, what you'll think is there's three different colors of a negat saras. You could have se'es, which is one color, a sapachas, which is another color, and a bahares, which is another color. Now, what the Gemara is explaining is, now let's understand what those words are. So now the Baharis, we explained it's very deep because that's Umar El Amok Bina'ar. So that's the whitest of the white because it's really deep. Now, Se'es, we're going to explain what does the term Se'es mean. In other words, what's the etymology of this word? Why does Se'es mean something which is white? So now, we know that these Negoim are going to be white, or if they're going to be red. Then, it's asking me if not hearing anything. I'm not sure if that's not working. But when it comes to se'es, se'es ain't se'es el gavah. Se'es means it's higher. V'cheinu omer al kol haharem haramim. So why is se'es called se'es? Because it's a more dim white. So now with the dimmer the white, the closer it's going to look for you. Look to you. Again, I don't know enough about this. I'm not an artist, but apparently that's how it works. The dimmer the white is, the closer it's going to look to you. So therefore, se'es refers to a whiter that's white, to a white that's whiter, and the Gemara brings a raya that that's what it means. I'll call haharam haramim, referring to mountains and hills and valleys. I'll call gavos hanisuos, that are lifted up. So we're talking about elevated surfaces. It's referred to as hanisuos, which is the same thing as se'es. So therefore, the se'es color is going to be a color that's more dim, which looks more close. Sapachas. So now we understand this word sapachas. What does that mean in the pasuk? I mentioned it says kiyah b'arvsar se'es o sapachas o b'haras. So what does sapachas mean? The Gemara says ein sapachas. The word sapachas always means a secondary category. The pasuk says it'll be secondary. This is a whole discussion where the Navi is talking about, where I think Elkanah was talking about Chafni and Pinchas, and he said that the Kohanim are going to be replaced with Tzadok, and then he said everyone is going to want to be a secondary category to that. So the Safcheni over here means there's a secondary. So now you have Se'es and Behares, which are the two primary mega colors, and you have Sapachas, which says there is a secondary category. Now ask me, Se'es, because the pasuk says Kiyeb Arbasar Se'es O Sapachas O Behares. So I know that you can have Se'es and its secondary category. How do I know that Behares has a secondary category? In other words, but according to Bekiva, that would be fine, because according to Bekiva, there is only a secondary category to Se'es. You have Behares on its own, and then you have Se'es has two secondary categories. But now, according to the Rabbanan, how do I know that Behares, which is the snow white color, has its secondary category? So it says white when it comes to Se'es, and it says white when it comes to Behares. Just like the whiteness that comes along with Se'es has a secondary category. When it says white, when it comes to a Behares, it also has a secondary category. In the Mishnah we learned, the pasuk put the word the word sapachas was inserted between the words Se'es and Behares, to teach you, just like there's a secondary category to Se'es, Behares. In other words, two different ways of understanding. And again, following the opinion of the Chachamim, that you have two categories, which is Se'es and Behares, and just in our language, snow and wool. So then, just like you have a secondary category to snow, which is lime, you have the secondary category to wool, which is egg membrane, and that's why the word sapachos was stuck between them. Okay, now the Gemara goes through just a few different illustrations, not illustrations, or examples of how we know what it is. Se'es, ketzemer lavan. Se'es is like white wool. Might tzemer lavan. What's this white wool that we're talking about? Amar of Bibi, Amar of Asi, Rabbi said the name of Asi, Tzemer Naki, it's clean wool, Ben Yomo, on the very first day of its birth. Shem Chavnin Bo Lemilas, that they prepare that for Milas. Now, Milas maybe translates as cashmere. I'm not sure if that's the way it translates, but it's I don't know what wool is called from a baby, but whatever the wool is called from a baby, very soft wool. If you look at Rashi explains this is what would happen. Rashi is the first skinny line in Rashi. He says, Lashon harachelim Yotzos Kivunos. He then explains, Kach Kishanola Keves. When this sheep is born, V'ha'im lo chachaso, its mother will lick it all off from all the remnants of the birth. Ein Tzemer Naki Ka'oso Yom. The wool is never going to be as clean as that day, because it's an animal. It spends time in the dirt, so therefore it gets very dirty. On that day, after the animal is born, its mother will lick it up, clean up all the wool, and on that day, the wool is going to be the brightest and the cleanest and the softest. Now, v'harotzelat snio lemilas, the person wants to save it for milas, for this type of material. Also lekeves ma'at ar umechavno alav. They make like this type of leather jacket they put on top of this little sheep. Mechavno alav, they tie it on. Shlo yisparid. And that wool will then be covered. So that's what they would do. The animal would be born, its mother would clean it up, then they would protect it, and sometimes you see like these dogs wearing like these little winter coats. So I guess they had this winter coat that they'd put on top of this sheep, and when the wool would be ready to be sheared, they would shear it off, and that was a very high quality, special type of wool that they would use. That's the tzemer that we're talking about. That's the wool that we're discussing over here. That was very, very white. Remember in the Chachamim, we had these skipped categories, and we mentioned this a number of times. I'm not going to go through it again. So what's the mashal for that? L'trei malchi, to two kings, u'l'trei farchi, and to two probably ministers or governors. In other words, different levels of government officers. So malcho shalzeh, lemala mi malcho shalzeh, this king is higher than the other king. The parcho shalzeh, lemala mi parcho shalzeh. And I guess the governor or the minister is going to be higher than that one. So now the Gemara says, hold on a second. That's Rabbi Kiva's opinion. In other words, if you think of it like this, you have think of like a supreme type of government like we have here in the United States. You have the federal government, then you have state government, you have the local government. So let's just say you have like the president and the vice president, and you have a governor and a lieutenant governor. So now what the Gemara says is you have this king is higher than that king, and then this minister is higher than that minister. So essentially what you have is president, governor, vice president, lieutenant governor. That's the way the Gemara explained it. Now the Gemara says, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not what we're trying to point out. We're trying to point something else out. The Gemara explained, no. Let me explain this again. What happens is you have the king is higher than his secondary minister. So you have the president is higher than the vice president. But the vice president is still in a more supreme position than the governor because he's part of the federal government. So you have the president, vice president, governor, lieutenant governor. So each one is going to be in its own category, but it ends up dividing. Now the Gemara wants to point out that each one is going to line up exactly how it works out with the Rabbanan. Doesn't really match with governor or president. It's not going to really work because it's really talking about two different states. That's the idea. Because if the way I'm explaining it, it's still going to only go in that category. You have president, vice president, governor, and then lieutenant governor. It's still not going to match. So that's not going to work. But that's the point. Next one. It's It's various different positions in the government. You have a malka, a king, al-kafta is another form of the government. Rufila, I think, is the head of the army. The Rashi says. It's Yipachas Shal Malka. The various different government officials, the Reish Galusa and the Reish Galusa. Again, that really describes, again, Haizel Amal Mizehu. Again, that's another problem where it's one on top of the next. In other words, you're just describing the breakdown of government from the most supreme position to the lowest position. So again, the Gemara says, El Yomalka Verufili, of the king and the king's minister that follows along with him. So now it could be you have the king and the minister. The minister's position is lower than the al-kafta, who is in a higher position. But ultimately, the way that they travel is that the king will travel together with his minister, even though that minister, I guess think of it like the press secretary. You have the president and the press secretary. The press secretary is definitely, from a governance perspective, lower than the governor of a state. Press secretary can make policy. However, when they travel together, so therefore it looks like that. Rabbi says, Kagon, Shvar Malka, you have Shvar, who is the king of the Shvar Malka is the Persian king, and then the Caesar, which is the Roman king. So Amar le Rapapa Rava. Rapapa said to Rava, Haiminai Adif. You're talking about a Persian king and a Roman king. Which one is better? Amar le, you said to him, Bichor Ka'achel. What do you live in the forest? You're sitting in the forest and eating. You have no idea what's going on. In other words, where are you? What planet do you live on that you don't know that the Roman king is much stronger than the Persian king? Now, the Rashi explains the reason why this interaction happened over here is because since he mentioned Shvar Malka first, which is the Persian king, and Papa lived under the Roman king, he didn't want to, God forbid, be accused of not recognizing that the Roman king was bigger, so therefore he had to clarify that point. In other words, you're living in the forest. Look at which one is bigger. The Sefer says in the pasuk, "V'tochal kol ara v'tedushna v'tizgen." In other words, it describes that the Roman king is going to be stronger. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Zu Romi." This refers to Romi, which is Romi Chayaves. In other words, the evil Roman dictatorship. Shetiva yatz b'chol olam. Its jurisdiction runs out throughout the whole world. Chol olam kula. Now, Ravina gives one more example for these colors, which is kigon glima de amar b'shachke. You have this wool garment and it got rubbed out, and sadina de kisna b'shachke, this linen garment, and it got rubbed out. So again, the way this works is the wool garment is very white when it starts off, and then it gets rubbed out, it's less white, and then you have the linen garment, which is quite bright white when it's new, then it gets rubbed out, it goes down. So, in other words, it will skip a category. Brightest is wool, but when it gets rubbed out, it loses a lot of its brightness. And then the second one is going to be the linen, which is pretty bright when it's new, but then when it gets rubbed out, it's all the way at the bottom because it loses its brightness. This is all describing the color scheme according to the Rabbanan. We'll stop here for today. Have a wonderful day.